Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with sushi rice. That's right, just because you don't make sushi at home does not mean you shouldn't learn how to make sushi rice, since this stuff is a very versatile and underrated side dish. In fact, I almost never make this to use for actual sushi, but much more so to serve alongside things like grilled meats, or as you saw recently with some completely authentic Hawaiian poke. But anyway, I did mention I'd show you how to make it, and that's what we're going to do. And it's going to start by finding some of this, sushi rice, which as you can probably see is a short grain variety. And this stuff's actually sold in different grades. And what that's based on is how perfect the grains of rice are. All right, with your higher grades, everything's going to be uniformly sized with virtually no broken grains, as opposed to the lower, less expensive grades, which by the way is what I'm using, which won't be quite as perfect. In fact, if you look closely here, you can see lots of broken grains and just general irregularity. But the good news is even this lower quality sushi rice still comes out very nice, especially considering we're not usually going to use this to make sushi with. So what we'll do is we'll dump a couple cups of our sushi rice in a strainer, and we will head over to the sink where we're going to run this under cold water for a couple minutes to rinse off the starch. And what we're looking for is for that runoff to go from cloudy and starchy to clear and starch-free. So don't be in a hurry, give it a couple minutes, until, like I said, that runoff water is completely clear. And then once that's happened, what we'll do is set that strainer in a bowl and let it dry for 1 hour. And by the way, some people do consider this an unnecessary step, but I'm not one of those people. I'm definitely into the hour drying method. So I'm going to let my rice sit there for exactly 1 hour, absorbing that water and drying out. At which point I'm going to transfer that into a heavy bottom saucepan, something that has a nice tight fitting lid. And we'll go ahead and add our water. And if you haven't done this before, it's probably less than you would imagine. But anyway, we're going to add our water and head to the stove to start the cooking process. And all that entails is placing this over medium-high heat and bringing it up to a simmer. And by the way, don't stir this. Just stand there and stare at it. And as soon as we can see little bubbles starting to form around the edge, we know we're getting close. So don't go anywhere, because what's going to happen as soon as this just starts to simmer, what we'll do is quickly cover it and turn our heat down to low and set our timer for exactly 10 minutes. And by the way, during this 10-minute period, don't go anywhere. Because as soon as that timer rings, we have to do two things very quickly. Okay, as soon as that rice is cooked exactly 10 minutes on low, we're going to turn off the heat. We're going to lift the lid up for exactly 1 second. We're going to quickly place the lid back down, and we're going to set our timer for another 10 minutes. At which point we'll be able to move to the final step, which is blending in the rice vinegar. All right, so while we're waiting for our timer to ring, we'll go ahead and get our stuff together for that process. And I'm actually going to show you this two different ways today. I'm going to show you the way I usually do it, which I prefer, and then the slightly more traditional method. So what I'm going to need handy once that timer rings is a sheet pan to toss this on, some seasoned rice vinegar, a fork with which to work it in, as well as a magazine to fan it. Oh yes, we're going to fan our rice. So what we'll do as soon as our timer rings is transfer that rice onto our sheet pan. And then basically what's going to happen here is we're going to sprinkle in our rice vinegar while we sort of separate and fluff that rice with our fork. And while we're doing that, we'll give it the occasional fan with our magazine. And I generally like to do this in two additions. So I'll sprinkle over about half that seasoned vinegar, just sort of dripping it in with my fingertips here and there, mixing it in as we fluff and fan that rice. And it really is helpful if you can do two different things with your arms at the same time. I don't really have that skill, but even so, it still worked. And then once that was mixed in, I went ahead and added the rest. And all we need to do here is continue mixing that with the fork while we fan this until the temperature of the rice is just barely over room temperature. And by the way, the reason we want to fan this is so it cools down a little quicker, which apparently improves the texture and helps create that gorgeous pearlescent look. Okay, so that's the thing that's supposed to give the sushi rice that little bit of glossiness. So like I said, we'll continue doing that until our rice cools to just barely over room temperature, which was the point I was at right here. And yes, I can see a couple drips of rice vinegar. Don't worry, I'll mix those in. But what I want to do right now is stop so I can show you how you know this came out right. So let me grab some of this rice. And by the way, to work with this stuff, you always have to have damp hands, otherwise it's going to stick. And I'm going to form this into that kind of log shape you usually see under the raw fish. And what'll happen if your sushi rice was properly made, you'll be able to mold it into any shape you want. And it'll hold together and be sturdy enough to lay a piece of fish over the top. But when we bite into this, which I'll demonstrate with the fork, it will pretty much crumble and collapse back into those individual grains of rice. So that right there is what you're shooting for. We want all the grains to be separate and perfectly cooked, but still sticky enough to shape into whatever we're going to use it for. So what you just saw was my preferred method with the pan and the fork. But what's more typical is for people to do this in a bowl using a thin bamboo rice paddle, which, by the way, I don't have. But I do have a wooden spoon that's about the same thickness, except it has a hole in the middle. But it's pretty much going to work the same. And whether you're going to do it with a fork or the more traditional bamboo rice paddle, it's still the same process. The one major difference for me, and I'm not sure if this is correct, because I'm using the bowl, I'll just sprinkle in all the rice vinegar at once. So with the pan method, it makes more sense for me to add it in 2 additions. But since we're using a bowl here, it feels like it's okay to add the vinegar at once. And one difference I find using this method, the rice does come out a little stickier. And I think that's just from the fact that using this paddle, we're rubbing more starch off the grains as we're mixing this up. So anyway, I continued on, and I finished this batch with the wooden paddle using the exact same technique. And once that was set, I wet my hands again so I could grab some of this so we could compare. And I tried to form it into the exact same shape and size. And to be honest, it pretty much came out exactly the same, except, like I said, slightly stickier. Now, was that from 30 seconds more cooking time? Or was my water measurement a tablespoon off? Who knows? But from my experience using both methods, using the fork and sheet pan instead of the bowl and paddle, the rice does come out a little less sticky. So I guess it's just up to your personal preference. You are the Vincent Price of your sushi rice. So don't be scared. Pick a method and be confident, and it will work. And then as far as service goes, if we are making sushi, we'll probably want to cover this with a damp towel so it doesn't dry out as we're working. But as I mentioned in the intro, I rarely make this to do sushi with. Mostly because I don't know how to make sushi. Oh sure, I can shape this into a log, and maybe top it with a thin slice of marinated tuna. Well actually, maybe I do know how to make sushi. But not very well. So when I make this, it's usually to serve as a side. And not only does this taste better than regular rice, because we've kicked it up with that seasoned rice vinegar, but above and beyond its deliciousness, it has such a user-friendly texture. I mean, again, all the grains are separate and perfectly cooked, yet it is very easy to press together into clumps, which makes it very chopstick-friendly. So this stuff really is fantastic as a side dish. But one last bonus suggestion. One thing I love to do is take one of those sheets of nori seaweed and cut it in quarters. And then using wet fingers, of course, we'll press down a little bit of that sushi rice. Not too much, just a thin layer. And don't smash it down too much. Use a nice light touch. And what I like to do after applying a little bit of that sushi rice to the seaweed is top it with some kind of flavorful meat, which this time was a little experiment I did with some spicy sesame beef. No, that's not video worthy yet. As well as some fresh cilantro and some hot sauce. And then what I'll do is kind of bring up these corners like this and make what I guess we'll call a seaweed and sushi rice taco. Check it out. These really are an incredibly fun and delicious variation on the taco. Plus, since we're not using tortilla, this is totally low carb, except for the rice. And I went with skirt steak here, but this same technology will work with so many different things. Like I said, even if you don't make sushi at home, which most normal people don't, you still really should have this incredible rice recipe in your arsenal. As I hopefully just demonstrated, it's just not for sushi anymore. So I really do hope you give that a try soon. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.